The alkali dust tasted like failure. It coated Isla's tongue, settled in the cracks of her lips, and filmed over her eyes until the Nevada sun became a dull, hazy smear in a bleached blue sky. Each step was a bargain made with the ground beneath her. One more, just one more, and then maybe another. The leather of her boots, worn thin and brittle, had given up hours ago, and the blister on her left heel had long since broken. Now, every footfall was a hot, wet grind of skin against leather, a rhythmic pulse of pain that kept time with the frantic beat of her heart. She was 19 years old and running from a life that had been laid out for her like a shroud. The town of Silver Creek wasn't much more than a muddy street and a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the side of a barren hill. But it had been her whole world, and in that world, she was a commodity. Her father, a man whose spine had been dissolved by whiskey and bad luck, had seen his last chance in the piggish eyes of Silas Croft. Croft owned the saloon, the hotel, and half the souls in Silver Creek. He was a man whose hands were always damp, whose laugh was like the sound of wet gravel being churned in a bucket. He was 40 years old, with a belly that strained the buttons of his waistcoat and a way of looking at Ela that made her feel like a piece of meat on a hook. The deal had been struck over a bottle of cheap rye, her father's debts erased, a small stipend for his remaining years, and Ela was the final binding clause in the contract. A wedding gift, her father had called it, his gaze skittering away from hers, unable to meet the quiet accusation in her eyes. He'll provide for you. A woman needs providing for. But Ela had seen how Silas Croft provided for the girls who worked in his saloon. She saw the bruises they covered with cheap powder, the deadness in their eyes as they poured drinks and forced smiles. She would not become one of them. She would not let her life be a slow dwindling in a dusty back room, her only purpose to be a vessel for a cruel man's appetites. So she had run. In the dead of night, she had slipped out of the small room she shared with her 2 younger sisters. She took the small pouch of coins she'd saved from mending clothes, not enough to get far, but enough for a start, and she took the gun. It was her mother's, a Colt Patterson, old and heavy. Rust bloomed in the etching on the barrel, and she wasn't even sure if it would fire, but holding its cold weight in her hand was a comfort. It was the only thing of her mother's she had left, and it felt like the only piece of her own will she could hold on to. Her plan, if it could be called that, was a desperate whisper she'd overheard between 2 drifters passing through Silver Creek. They spoke of a man on the edge of the territory, a cowboy who lived alone, beholden to no one. Jed Callan. The name was spoken with a mix of fear and respect. They said he was fast with a gun, that he kept to himself in a way that was unnatural, but they also told a story about how 3 claim jumpers had tried to run a family off their land and had set their sights on the farmer's young daughter. Jed Callan had been passing through. He hadn't said a word. He'd just stepped between the men and the girl. When the dust settled, the 3 claim jumpers were dead in the dirt, and Callan had ridden on without so much as taking the drink of water the grateful farmer offered. A killer who protected a child. The contradiction had lodged itself in Isla's mind. A man that dangerous, that solitary, wouldn't be bound by the laws of men like Silas Croft. He wouldn't care about a contract signed in a saloon. He was an outcast, a ghost on the edge of the world. He was her only hope. So she had walked east, away from Silver Creek, away from the future that awaited her there. She walked with a single, burning thought, a prayer that had become a dare. It wasn't just about escaping Silas. It was about claiming something for herself before her life was claimed from her. In Silver Creek, she was an object, a bargaining chip. Out here, in the vast, crushing emptiness of the desert, she was at least her own person, even if that person was about to die. The thought had been her constant companion, a rhythm against the pain in her feet and the ache in her soul. I don't want to die untouched. It wasn't a girl's silly dream of romance. It was a raw, primal need to own one single moment of her existence, to choose, to have a memory that wasn't of her father's shame or Silas Croft's damp hands. A memory of a touch that was not a claim of ownership, but a simple, human connection, freely given and freely received. Just one. If she was to be hunted down and dragged back, or if she was to perish out here under the indifferent sun, she would not go as a blank page. She would have one line, written in her own hand. The sun climbed higher. The world dissolved into a shimmering wave of heat. The water in her canteen was hot and tasted of tin. She took small, measured sips, but it wasn't enough. Her head grew light, and the horizon began to swim. She thought of her sisters, their sleeping faces in the pale moonlight. A pang of guilt, sharp and swift, pierced through her exhaustion. Had she been selfish to leave them? But what good would she have been to them as Silas Croft's property? A broken woman with dead eyes. No, her only chance to ever help them was to save herself first. She stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock. She went down hard, the impact jarring through her bones. The rusty pistol slipped from her waistband and landed in the dust beside her. For a long moment, she just lay there, the sun baking her back. It would be so easy to stop, to close her eyes and let the desert take her. It would be a cleaner end than the one Croft had planned. But then she saw his face, in her mind the smug satisfaction, the certainty of his ownership. The anger that rose in her was a hotter fire than the sun itself. It burned away the despair. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. She picked up the gun, brushed the dust from it with a trembling hand, and tucked it back into her waistband. She looked at the vast, empty expanse ahead of her. The rumor had been vague. On the edge of the Black Rock Desert, the drifter had said, "You'll see the smoke from his chimney before you see the cabin." For 2 days, she had seen nothing but rock and sagebrush. Now, her hope was as dry as her throat. Maybe the story was just that, a story. Maybe Jed Callan didn't exist. Maybe she was chasing a ghost and walking toward her own grave. She shielded her eyes, her gaze sweeping the horizon, and then she saw it. At first, she thought it was another heat shimmer, a trick of the light, but it was steady. A thin gray tendril rising into the sky. Smoke. A sound escaped her. Half sob, half laugh. It wasn't a town. It was a single, lonely plume. It had to be him. The sight gave her a strength she didn't know she still possessed. Her steps became surer, her purpose renewed. The pain in her foot was a distant thing, a dull throb that no longer mattered. All that mattered was that thin line of smoke. It took her another hour, an hour that stretched into an eternity. The landscape began to change subtly. The flat alkali plain gave way to rolling, rocky hills, and then, nestled in a shallow basin, protected from the wind, she saw it, a cabin. It was small and rough, built of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney that looked as solid as the hills around it, a low fence made of gnarled juniper posts and wire, enclosed a small patch of ground where a lean horse stood swishing its tail. A dog, a brown and white mix with a lame back leg, lifted its head from the porch, watched her approach, but didn't bark. The place was silent. It felt still, as if it were holding its breath. Isla's legs felt like they were made of water. She reached the juniper fence and leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The world tilted, the edges of her vision going dark. She had made it. She had walked out of one life and arrived at the doorstep of another. Now all that was left was the asking. The thought was more terrifying than the entire journey. What would she say? How could she voice the desperate, shameful need that had driven her across a wasteland? The cabin door opened. He filled the doorway, a tall silhouette against the dark interior. The sun was behind him, so she couldn't see his face clearly, just the broad set of his shoulders and the long lines of his legs in dusty denim. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching her. The dog on the porch thumped its tail once, a soft, welcoming sound in the profound silence. Isla pushed herself off the fence. She took one step, then another. Her body was screaming in protest, but her will dragged it forward. She had not come this far to falter at the end. She reached the porch steps, her gaze fixed on the man in the doorway. As she drew closer, his features came into focus. He was younger than she had imagined, maybe 30. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his dark hair long and unkempt. A faint, white scar cut a line across his right cheekbone, pulling at the corner of his eye and giving him a look of permanent watchfulness. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they held no welcome, no curiosity, only a deep, unnerving stillness. She stopped at the foot of the steps, her legs trembling so badly she was afraid she would fall. All the words she had rehearsed in her mind, all the possible ways to explain, they all vanished, turned to dust like everything else in this land. All that was left was the truth, the raw, desperate core of her journey. She looked up at him, this dangerous, solitary man, and held his steady gaze. The strength that had carried her across the desert gave her voice. It was hoarse, cracked, little more than a whisper, but it carried in the silent air. She had meant to ask for one night, to state her dare, but as she stood there, swaying on the edge of collapse, all she could manage was the beginning of it, the preamble to her desperate plea. Her world narrowed to the space between them, to the quiet hum of the heat and the weight of his stare. Her journey was over. She was here. She had found the cowboy. He did not move for a full minute, a block of shadow and sun-hardened silence in the frame of the door. To Isla, that minute stretched into a dry, breathless eternity. The heat pressed down on her. The silence of the vast country behind her pushed at her back, and the man in front of her was a wall she could not pass. Her own heartbeat was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. She could see him more clearly now. The scar on his cheek was silvered, an old wound from a blade or a barb, and it pulled the skin tight, giving one eye a permanent, narrow squint of appraisal. His eyes, she saw, weren't just stormy. They were the color of deep water under a leaden sky, and they held a kind of emptiness that wasn't vacant, but scoured clean. It was the look of a man who had seen too much and had decided to stop looking. His hands hung loose at his sides, big and calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were hands that knew work and, she suspected, violence. There was no weapon on his hip, but he wore the stillness of a man who was never unarmed. The world had shrunk to this small patch of baked earth and the 3 wooden steps that separated her from him. She felt the last of her strength begin to unravel. The black edges of her vision crept inward. She had walked for 3 days, fueled by a single, desperate idea, and now that she was here, the sheer madness of it threatened to buckle her knees. What had she been thinking to walk into the wilderness and find a killer, a stranger, and ask him for what? For a memory, for a moment of warmth before the cold consumed her. Her throat was a knot of dust and fear. She had to speak before she collapsed. She had to give voice to the dare that had been her compass. She drew a breath, and it was like inhaling fire. The words came out, torn from her, raw and brittle. I want one night. The sound of her own voice was shocking in the quiet. It was thin, reedy, the voice of a frightened girl. Not the resolute woman she had tried to be. She saw a flicker in his eyes, the first sign of life in their stony depths. It wasn't surprise. It was something else. Recognition, perhaps, of a desperation that matched the landscape. She forced herself to continue, to say the rest of it before her courage deserted her completely. I want to choose it, before the world chooses for me again. There, it was said. The shameful, terrible, honest truth of her pilgrimage was laid bare on the dusty ground between them. She expected anything, a harsh laugh, an order to leave, the cold, flat dismissal of a man who had no time for the troubles of a runaway girl. She braced herself, her whole body tight as a drawn bowstring. waiting for the impact of his rejection. He did nothing. He simply stood there, his gaze locked on her. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was heavier, charged with the weight of her words. It pressed in, suffocating. A fly buzzed lazily past her ear, an impossibly loud sound. The lame dog on the porch shifted, its claws making a soft scratching noise on the wood. Jed Callan remained motionless, a statue carved from dust and regret. His eyes traveled over her, slow and deliberate. It was not the predatory way Silas Croft had looked at her, a butcher assessing a cut of meat. This was different. It was a complete and thorough inventory. His gaze took in her dress, once a respectable blue gingham, now torn at the hem and bleached pale by the sun, caked in a fine white dust. It lingered on her hands, clenched into fists at her sides. The knuckles white, it dropped to her feet, to the ruined leather of her boots and the dark, angry stain on her stocking where the blister had bled through. He saw the rusty butt of the Patterson pistol tucked into her waistband, a child's charm against monsters. He looked back at her face, at the sunburnt patch on her nose, the wildness in her hair, and the fever-bright terror in her eyes. He was reading her story. He was seeing the miles she had walked, the fear that had driven her, and the foolish, fragile hope that had brought her to his door. Isla felt stripped bare under that silent scrutiny, more exposed than if she had stood before him with no clothes at all. She felt the hot shame rise in her cheeks. He must think her a fool, or worse, a woman of low morals, wandering the desert and offering herself to the first man she found. The thought sent a fresh wave of despair through her. She had been so certain, in the abstract, in the desperate flight from Silver Creek. Jed Callan had been a solution, a means to an end, a dangerous tool to be used for a single purpose. But standing here, a few feet from the living, breathing man, she saw the flaw in her plan. He was not a tool. He was a person, with a past and a will of his own. And she had come to him with a request so strange, so intimate, that it had no name. Her legs finally gave way. She didn't fall, but she sagged, her hand flying out to grip the rough wood of the fence post to keep herself upright. A low moan escaped her lips. It was over. She had failed. He would send her away, and she would walk back into the desert until she fell for the last time. And then he moved. It was a small shift, a simple transfer of weight from one foot to the other, but it broke the spell. He stepped out of the shadow of the doorway and onto the porch, into the full, harsh light of the afternoon sun. Now she could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the way his dark hair was streaked with the lighter strands of brown. He was just a man, a tired, scarred man who looked as though he carried the weight of the whole sky on his shoulders. He walked past her, his boots making a soft, solid sound on the wooden planks. He didn't even glance at her as he went to the edge of the porch where a tin basin sat on an old barrel. He picked up a ladle, dipped it into the water barrel beside it, and drank, his throat working. He was ignoring her, the final, cruelest dismissal. He was going to let her stand there until she simply faded away. The fight went out of her, the anger that had burned so hot, the defiance that had carried her so far. It all turned to ash. All that was left was a hollow ache. She closed her eyes, her forehead resting against the splintery wood of the fence post. The sound of his footsteps returning made her flinch. She opened her eyes, expecting to see him standing over her, ready to tell her to leave. But he wasn't empty-handed. In his arms, he held a thick gray wool blanket. It was coarse and well-worn. Folded into a neat square, he stopped in front of her, so close she could smell the scent of dust, leather, and something else, the faint, clean smell of the dry wind. He held the blanket out to her. Isla stared at it, uncomprehending. Her mind was too slow, too thick with exhaustion to understand the gesture. It wasn't a yes, it wasn't a no. It was a blanket. She looked up at his face, searching for an answer. His expression was unchanged. The stormy eyes gave nothing away. But then he gave a single, slow nod, a slight, almost imperceptible inclination of his head. The gesture was so small, yet it landed in her soul with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an answer to the question she had asked. Not directly. It was an answer to a question she hadn't dared to voice. A question of safety. A question of sanctuary. The nod did not say, "Yes, I will give you what you want." It said, "You can stop running now." A single tear, hot and thick, broke free and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. She didn't sob. She didn't have the strength for it. The tears just fell, a silent testament to the release of a tension she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it was like to be without it. Her trembling hand reached out and took the blanket. The wool was rough against her skin, a solid, grounding reality. Its weight was substantial, a promise of warmth and cover. It was the kindest thing anyone had offered her in years. She didn't need to be told what it meant. Permission to stay, permission to rest. He turned then, without another look, and walked back into the cool darkness of the cabin, leaving her alone on the porch with the lame dog in the setting sun. Isla sank down onto the top step, the strength finally leaving her limbs in a great, shuddering rush. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, the coarse wool a comforting armor against the coming chill of the desert night. She was still a stranger. Her request still hung, unanswered, in the vast, silent air, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She was not running. She was here, and she had been allowed to stay. The first dawn in Jed Callan's camp was a quiet revelation. Isla woke on the porch, curled in the gray wool blanket, to a sky the color of a pale pearl. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, bitter perfume of sagebrush. The world felt scrubbed new. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. And the absence of the familiar damp, sour smell of Silver Creek was a relief so profound it felt like a physical untying of a knot in her chest. Then she remembered. The endless desert, the cabin, the silent man. He was already up, a thin plume of smoke, just like the one that had guided her here, rose from the stone chimney. She could hear the soft clink of metal on metal from inside, the sound of a man preparing for the day. Her body ached with a deep, bone-weary soreness. Her foot throbbed in a steady, dull rhythm. But she was alive, and she was, for the moment, safe. Their life together found its shape in that silence. It was a life dictated by the sun and by necessity, with an invisible fence running straight through the middle of it. He lived inside the cabin. She lived on the porch. He never crossed the threshold to her space unless it was to leave something for her, a tin plate of beans and jerky in the evening, a cup of hot, black coffee in the morning. She, in turn, never presumed to enter his. The doorway was a border she did not dare to cross without invitation, and none was ever offered. On that first full day, after drinking the coffee he'd left on the top step, she set about making herself useful. It was a compulsion born of a lifetime of earning her keep. She could not bear to be idle, to be a simple charity case. She limped to the well, her blisters screaming in protest. The bucket was heavy, the rope coarse against her soft hands. It took her 3 tries to haul a full bucket of water to the surface, her arms shaking with the effort. She filled the basin on the porch, then refilled the large barrel he used for drinking water. When she was done, she saw him standing in the doorway, watching. He said nothing, his face impassive, but he had watched. She learned his routines by observation. He would rise before the sun, see to his horse, a tough-looking buckskin, and then ride out, a rifle scabbarded on his saddle. He would be gone for hours, sometimes for the entire day, returning with a rabbit or 2 slung over his saddle horn. In the afternoons, he worked around the small homestead. He mended harnesses with a slow, methodical precision, his large hands surprisingly deft with the awl and thread. He sharpened an axe on a whetstone. the rhythmic shing 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 of steel on stone, one of the few consistent sounds in the vast quiet. Isla, in turn, carved out her own sphere of work. She took over the cooking. At first, it was just roasting the rabbits he brought back over the open fire pit. Then, exploring a small, well-organized pantry just inside the cabin door, she found flour, beans, and dried corn. She began to make johnny cakes and thick bean stew. She would leave his portion on the small, rough-hewn table inside, then retreat to the porch to eat her own. He never commented on the food, but he always ate every last bite. She took to caring for the dog, a scruffy creature Jed called Trip. The dog's back leg was twisted at an awkward angle, an old injury that had healed badly, forcing him to move with a three-legged hop. He was a quiet animal, much like his master, but his brown eyes were soft and knowing. Hila would sit on the steps and talk to him in a low voice, scratching behind his ears as she told him about the sisters she missed and the town she'd fled. Trip would rest his head on her knee and thump his tail, a loyal, silent confidant. She saw Jed watch them sometimes from the corner of his eye as he worked. His gaze lingered on her hand as she stroked the dog's fur, and, for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something other than emptiness in his expression. But then it was gone, and the mask of indifference was back in place. Days bled into a week, then two. The invisible fence between them remained. They shared a roof, a fire, and the same vast, lonely sky. But they were two separate islands. His silence was a constant, unnerving presence. Isla found herself trying to decipher it, to read meaning into every glance, every gesture. Was it contempt? Did he look at her and see a worthless creature? A woman who had offered herself to a stranger? The thought made a hot, sick shame churn in her stomach. She had been so desperate, so driven by her singular, burning need, that she hadn't considered how her request might sound to a man like him. Maybe he had let her stay out of a kind of weary disgust, the way a man might allow a stray dog to sleep on his porch because it was easier than chasing it away. When this thought took hold, she would work harder, scrubbing the cooking pot until it shone, mending a tear in his shirt she found slung over a chair, her stitches small and neat. She was trying to prove her worth, to show him she was more than her desperate proposition. Or was it something else? Was he hiding something? She knew the story of how he'd killed 3 men to protect a child. Perhaps he was a man so steeped in violence that he had forgotten how to be gentle. Perhaps he kept his distance because he was afraid of what he might do, or what he had already done. She would watch his hands as he repaired a bridle, noting the controlled strength in them, and wonder what they were capable of. She had come here seeking a man who could kill, and now she lived with him. And the reality of that was a cold knot of fear in her belly. His silence was a mirror. It reflected all her own fears and insecurities back at her. Some days, she was certain he despised her. On others, she was convinced he was simply a broken man, a kindred spirit in a different kind of prison. The not knowing was a slow torture. The question she had asked on that first day still hung between them, unanswered and unacknowledged. He had given her sanctuary, but he had not given her an answer, and with every passing day of silent coexistence, her request felt more and more foolish, more and more impossible. One night, the wind picked up. It was a dry, restless wind that moaned through the rocks and rattled the single window pane of the cabin. It smelled of distant rain that would never fall here. The sky was awash with stars, so bright and cold they seemed to crackle in the infinite darkness. Isla couldn't sleep. She sat on the top step, the gray blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, and listened to the wind's lonely song. She knew Jed was awake inside. There was no light from his window, but she could feel his presence, a weight on the other side of the wall. The silence in the cabin was as profound as the silence of the desert, and tonight it felt unbearable. For 2 weeks, she had lived by his unspoken rules. She had been quiet, useful, and unobtrusive. She had waited for a sign, a word, anything. But nothing had come. The uncertainty had worn her down. chipping away at the fragile sense of self she was trying to rebuild. She had to know. She had to know how he saw her. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, her back to the cabin door. She wrapped her arms around herself, facing the vast, dark emptiness of the desert. The wind whipped strands of her hair across her face. She spoke into the wind, her voice low but clear, not entirely sure if she was speaking to him or just to the night itself. "Do you think I'm foolish?" The words were out before she could call them back. They sounded small and pathetic against the howl of the wind. She immediately regretted them. What a weak, childish question. She stood rigid, her eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the silence that would surely follow a silence that would be her answer. He would not even grant her the dignity of a reply. Several long seconds passed. The only sound was the wind. She felt a familiar sting behind her eyes. Of course he wouldn't answer. She was a fool for running, a fool for coming here, a fool for asking. Then, a voice from the darkness behind her. It was rough, gravelly from disuse, like stones being rolled over one another. "No." The word was so unexpected it was like a physical jolt. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the wind and landed squarely in the center of her being. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was standing in the open doorway, a dark shape barely visible against the deeper darkness of the cabin. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. The simple, one-word answer was enough. It was more than enough. It was a release, a validation she hadn't realized she was so desperate for. But he wasn't finished. The wind died down for a moment, and in the sudden lull, his voice came again, still low, still rough, but with a different texture to it now. Something that sounded almost like understanding. "Just brave in a broken way." Isla stared at the shadow in the doorway. Brave in a broken way. He didn't see her as a fool. He didn't see her as wicked or weak. He saw the bravery in her flight, but he also saw the wounds that had made it necessary. He saw that her desperate request hadn't come from a place of wantonness, but from a place of profound damage. In 6 quiet words, he had seen her more clearly than anyone in her entire life. He had taken her shame and her desperation and her foolish plan, and he had given them a new name. Not foolishness, bravery. He stood there for another moment, then stepped back into the cabin, closing the door with a soft, final click. He left her alone on the porch, but the space no longer felt empty. The invisible fence was still there, the distance between them still vast, but its nature had changed. It was no longer a fence of contempt or judgment. The silence that settled once more was not an absence of words, but a space that held a new and fragile understanding. Isla pulled the blanket tighter, but it wasn't the cold she was fighting anymore. She looked out at the stars, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt the faint, flickering warmth of hope. His words, brave in a broken way, had settled over Ila's world like a soft fall of evening snow, quieting the noisy clamor of her self-doubt. In the days that followed, the invisible fence between them remained, but it no longer felt like a barrier of judgment. It was simply a fact of the landscape, like the rocky hills or the vast, empty sky. A quiet understanding had taken root in the silence. She still lived on the porch, and he in the cabin, but they were no longer just two strangers occupying the same small patch of dirt. They were two solitary creatures who had, by some strange twist of fate, found a way to be solitary together. The routine became a comfort. The morning coffee, the shared, unspoken labor of survival. She found a strange peace in the rhythm of the days. The fear that had been her constant companion on the journey from Silver Creek had receded, becoming a faint, distant hum. Here, in the profound quiet of Jed Callan's homestead, the threats of the world seemed very far away. It was a Tuesday, she thought, though the days had begun to lose their names. The sun was high and hot, beating down on the parched earth. Jed was at the far end of the small corral, reshoeing his buckskin horse. The rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil was the only sound, a steady, metallic heartbeat in the sleepy afternoon. Isla sat on the porch steps, mending one of Jed's shirts. The fabric was rough, worn thin at the elbows, and she worked with small, careful stitches, her needle dipping and rising. Trip, the lame dog, was asleep in the shade at her feet, his good back leg twitching as he chased dream rabbits. The peace was absolute. It was a stillness so complete that the disturbance, when it came, felt like a physical tearing of the air. It started as a shimmer on the horizon, a faint plume of dust rising against the endless blue. At first, Isla paid it no mind. The desert was full of Trick's dust devils, heat hazes that looked like lakes of cool water. But this was different. The plume was steady, moving in a straight line, growing larger. It was a rider. A cold fist of dread clenched in her stomach. No one came out here. The drifters who had spoken of Jed Callan had described his place as the end of the world. A visitor was an anomaly, a violation. Trip sensed it, too. He lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His ears were perked, his body tense, all his attention focused on the approaching dust cloud. The hammering from the corral stopped. The sudden silence was more alarming than the sound had been. Isla looked over and saw Jed standing perfectly still, his back to her. He hadn't turned around, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her skin, that he was aware of the rider. His whole posture had changed. He was no longer a man at work. He was a predator that had scented danger. Isla's heart began to pound a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. Her hands, which had been so steady with the needle just moments before, began to tremble. She dropped the shirt into her lap. It could be anyone, a lost prospector, a trapper. But she knew it wasn't. The fear that had been dormant for weeks woke with a vicious snarl. The world she had run from had found her. The rider grew closer, resolving from a dusty blur into the shape of a man on a horse. He was riding a tall bay, and he sat his saddle with a lazy, arrogant slump. As he neared the juniper fence, Isla's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him. His name was Finn. He was one of Silas Croft's men, a saloon bully who enforced his boss's will with a smug grin and a quick fist. He wore a cheap, flashy vest over a sweat-stained shirt, and the sun glinted off a silver concho on his hatband. He was Silver Creek made flesh, and he had brought its stench with him. Finn reined in his horse just outside the fence, his gaze sweeping over the small homestead with open contempt. He saw the lame dog, the rough cabin, and then his eyes landed on Isla. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face, a greasy, knowing look that made her feel as if she were covered in filth. "Well, now," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Look what the wind blew in. Mr. Croft's been wondering where his property got to." He didn't use her name. He called her property. The word was a slap. Isla felt the blood drain from her face. She instinctively scrambled backward, shuffling up the steps until her back was pressed against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. Jed turned then. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that held no hint of hurry, yet every line of his body was taut with readiness. He walked from the corral toward the cabin, his boots stirring up little puffs of dust. He didn't look at Finn. He looked at Isla, his stormy eyes holding hers for a single, fleeting second. It wasn't a look of reassurance. It was a look of assessment, a silent question. Then he turned his attention to the man on the horse. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, placing himself directly between Isla and Finn. He was a living shield. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't drawn a weapon, but his position was an unmistakable declaration. Finn's smug smile faltered for a moment. He looked Jed up and down, taking in the dusty clothes, the scarred face, the unnerving stillness. His gaze lingered on the worn Colt revolver holstered on Jed's hip. His confidence returned, bolstered by the authority of the man he worked for. "You, the man of the house," old-timer Finn sneered. his tone dripping with condescension. "Hate to interrupt your quiet life, but the girl there, she's coming with me. There's a contract, signed and sealed. She belongs to Mr. Croft now." Jed remained silent. His hands hung loose at his sides. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on Finn. He didn't so much as blink. The silence unnerved Finn. He was used to bluster, to arguments, to fear. This utter lack of reaction was like shouting at a rock wall. He shifted in his saddle, his horse stamping a nervous foot. "Did you hear me?" Finn demanded, his voice a little louder now. "I ain't asking. I'm telling Mr. Croft sent me to collect what's his. Now, she can come easy, or she can come hard. It's no never mind to me." He swung his leg over, preparing to dismount. "But she's coming." It was the moment the world held its breath. As Finn's boot reached for the ground, Jed moved. It was not a fast motion. It was a slow, fluid gesture, as inevitable as a sunrise. His right hand came up and rested on the worn wooden grip of his Colt. He didn't draw it. He just let his hand lie there, his thumb, with a deliberation that was more menacing than any threat, pulled the hammer back. The click of the sear engaging was impossibly loud. It was a sharp, clean, metallic sound that cut through the afternoon heat and echoed in the vast silence. It was the only sound in the world, a sound that promised another, louder sound to follow, a sound that was a full stop at the end of a conversation. Finn froze, one foot in the stirrup, the other hovering over the ground. His eyes, which had been full of smug authority, were now wide, fixed on Jed's hand. He finally seemed to understand that he was not dealing with a simple hermit. He slowly raised his gaze from the gun to Jed's face, and for the first time, Isla saw what those drifters had seen, what had made 3 armed men fall in the dirt. Jed's eyes were not angry. They were not filled with hate. They were empty. It was a terrifying, absolute emptiness, a void where fear and mercy and hesitation had ceased to exist. It was the look of a man who had already made his decision. Looking into Jed Callan's eyes at that moment was like looking into an open grave that had been dug just for you. Finn was a bully and a braggart, a man who preyed on the weak. He was not a man who was prepared to die on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of nowhere for a job. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He slowly, carefully, pulled his leg back over the saddle. He didn't take his eyes off Jed. He cleared his throat, but when he spoke, his voice was a dry, cracking whisper. "No need for trouble, just doing my job." Jed said nothing. His hand remained on his gun. His eyes remained empty. Finn began to back his horse away, one slow, shuffling step at a time. He was trying to project an air of casual retreat, but the tension in his shoulders and the tight grip he had on the reins betrayed him. When he had put 20 yards between them, he finally turned the horse and kicked it into a gallop, fleeing as if the devil himself were on his heels. They stood there, Isla on the porch, Jed on the ground below, and watched until the plume of dust that was Finn had vanished back into the haze from which it had come. Only then did Jed's thumb move, gently lowering the hammer of his pistol back to its resting place. The danger was over. The world was quiet again. He turned, and for a moment, he looked up at Isla. Her legs were trembling so violently she had to grip the porch railing to stay upright. Tears were streaming down her face, but she made no sound. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. And then he turned and walked back toward the corral, back to his work. The confrontation was over. For him, the day simply continued. But for Isla, everything had changed. She sank onto the steps, her body limp with relief. As the terror receded, something else rose in its place, a profound, earth-shattering understanding. She thought of Finn's words. Property belongs to collect what's his. She thought of her father's wheedling excuses, of Silas Croft's wet, possessive whispers. All her life, Words had been used as weapons against her. They were chains, contracts, brands of ownership. They were tools to diminish her, to define her, to trap her. And Jed, in the face of that threat, he had used no words at all. His entire defense of her had been a series of silent actions. He had positioned his body as a shield. He had laid his hand on his gun. He had spoken with a look in his eyes that was more powerful and absolute than any sentence ever uttered. His silence, which she had mistaken for contempt or a hidden darkness, was neither. It was a choice. It was a rejection of a world that used language to lie and to wound. Jed Callan didn't speak often because he had seen what words could do. He had seen people use them to hurt and betray. So he had built his life around a different language, the language of action, of stillness, of unwavering intent. In a world full of noise, his silence was the most honest thing she had ever known. He had stood before the ugliness of her past and had not said a word, and in doing so, he had said everything. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the undersides of the high, thin clouds in brutal shades of orange and purple. The day's oppressive heat finally broke, and a cool evening air began to seep out of the rocks. Neither of them spoke as they ate. Jed had roasted a rabbit, and Isla had made a pan of Johnny cakes over the fire. They sat on opposite sides of the small, crackling blaze. The space between them filled with the memory of the afternoon's confrontation. The silence was different now. It was no longer a simple absence of noise. It was a shared space, heavy with the weight of what had happened, with what Jed had done for her. Finn's sneering voice echoed in Isla's mind. Property belongs to collect what's his. The words had been meant to strip her of her humanity, to reduce her to a thing. But Jed's silent, unhesitating defense had given it back to her. He had stood between her and that ugliness, a bulwark of quiet resolve. She owed him an explanation. She owed him the truth. The story he had read in her ruined boots and her haunted eyes was incomplete. He deserved the words. When they had finished eating, Jed took their tin plates and rinsed them at the water barrel. Isla watched him, his movements economical and sure. He returned to the fire, taking his seat on a smooth, flat rock that seemed to be his accustomed chair. He picked up a long, dry stick and began to poke at the embers, sending a shower of sparks into the deepening twilight. Isla took a breath. Her hands, resting in her lap, were cold. He won't be the last one, she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Jed didn't look up, but his hand stilled. He was listening. They'll send more, she continued. Silas Croft. He's not a man who lets go of things he thinks he owns. She waited for him to say something, to ask who Silas Croft was, to ask why they were after her. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the glowing heart of the fire. His silence was an invitation, a blank page for her to write her story on. He would not pry it from her. She had to offer it freely. My father, she began, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He's a man who has made a long habit of losing. He lost his wife, my mother, to a fever. He lost his nerve to the bottom of a whiskey bottle. And then he lost his last dollar on a card game he never should have played. She looked down at her own hands, at the faint calluses forming from hauling water and chopping wood. They were starting to look like her own. The man he lost it all to was Silas Croft, Mr. Croft owned the saloon, and he owned my father's debt. My father had nothing left to give him, nothing but me. The fire popped, spitting a glowing ember onto the dirt near Jed's boot. He nudged it back into the flames with the toe of his boot, his face a mask of shadows and flickering orange light. It was a business arrangement, Isla said, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion that was churning inside her. Mr. Croft would forgive the debt. In exchange, he would get a wife. My father called it a wedding gift. He told me I would be provided for. He said it was my duty. She could feel it all again, the thick, stale air of the saloon where the deal had been finalized, the damp pressure of Croft's hand on her arm, the way her father's gaze had slid away from hers. unable to witness the transaction he had just made. He was twice my age. He had a wife before, a woman who fell down the stairs. That's what they said. The girls who worked for him. They all had a look in their eyes, like a candle that had been snuffed out. I knew that would be my future. To be his property, in his house, in his bed. To have that look in my eyes until I, too, had an accident. She finally looked up, meeting Jed's gaze across the fire. He was looking at her now, his stormy eyes holding hers. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a deep, still attention. He was seeing her. He was hearing her. The wedding was to be on a Sunday. On Saturday night, I took the coins I had saved, and I took my mother's old pistol. I didn't know if it would even fire, and I walked out. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't die in that town, in that man's house. I couldn't die as his thing. I wanted to feel something that was my own choice. Just once. That's why I came here. It was a foolish idea. Not foolish, Jed said, his voice a low rumble. He repeated the words he had spoken once before, brave in a broken way. His validation, spoken again in the face of her full, shameful confession, was a balm on a wound she didn't know was still so raw. A tear escaped her, and she wiped it away angrily with the back of her hand. "He thinks I belong to him," she whispered, "and he will send men until he gets me back." The fire crackled between them. The stars were beginning to appear, cold and brilliant in the black sky. For a long time, the only sounds were the fire and the wind. Isla thought that was the end of it. She had laid her story at his feet, a burden she had brought to his door. She expected him to simply nod, to accept it as another fact of his hard life. But then he spoke, his eyes leaving her face to stare back into the flames. "I had a sister," he said. The words were unexpected, and they carried a weight of old pain that made Isla's own troubles feel suddenly small. Her name was Clara. She was 17, all light and laughter. She thought the world was a good place. She saw the best in people, even when it wasn't there. He shifted the stick in his hand, his knuckles white in the firelight. "Our PA died when we were young. It was just me and her and our ma. I was the man of the house. I guess it was my job to protect them." He let out a short, harsh breath that was not a laugh. "I took a job riding for a cattle drive. Good money. We needed it. I was gone for 4 months. I told her I'd be back before the first snow. I promised her I'd bring her a new ribbon for her hair, a blue one to match her eyes." The silence stretched. Isla held her breath, knowing she was treading on sacred, sorrowful ground. "There were men, drifters. They came through while I was gone. They saw 2 women alone on a small farm. They saw something easy." He paused, his jaw tight. "Ma tried to fight them. They hurt her bad. But Clara, she fought them harder." He stopped speaking. He didn't need to say the rest. The story was there in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the profound grief that had hollowed out his eyes. "I got back a week later," he said, his voice flat and dead. "The snow had already started. The blue ribbon was still in my saddlebag. I was too late. All the promises, all the words about protecting them, they didn't mean a thing. Words are cheap. Promises break. Being there in time is the only thing that matters. And I wasn't." He tossed the stick into the fire. It landed in the glowing heart of the embers and burst into flame, consumed in seconds. Isla finally understood. She understood the silence, the solitude, the haunted emptiness in his eyes. He lived in the aftermath of that failure. He had built a fortress of solitude around himself, not to keep the world out, but because he believed he had failed in his most fundamental duty. He didn't trust himself to protect anyone ever again, because the one time it had mattered most, he had been too late. His defense of her that afternoon hadn't just been about her. It had been about Clara. He had been there in time today. They sat there for what felt like hours. 2 broken people sharing the same fire, their separate griefs and fears laid bare in the flickering light. The chasm of silence that had once separated them was now bridged by a fragile, painful understanding. He was not a monster. He was a man mourning a ghost, and she was not a fool. She was a woman fighting for a life. Eventually, the fire burned down to a bed of soft, pulsing coals. The desert night was in full command now, the sky a vast sweep of diamond dust stars. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion settled over Isla. It was not the physical exhaustion of her journey, but the emotional exhaustion of finally setting down a heavy burden. She didn't say goodnight. Words felt clumsy and inadequate. She simply stood up, walked to her bedroll on the porch, and lay down, pulling the gray wool blanket up to her chin. Jed remained by the fire, a dark, unmoving silhouette against the glowing embers. He was a guardian, a silent watcher in the night. Isla closed her eyes. She was acutely aware of his presence, just a few yards away. He was a man who had killed, a man of profound and dangerous capabilities, a man who carried a sorrow so deep it had shaped his entire existence. And she was not afraid. For the first time since she was a little girl, before her mother had died and her father had started drinking. She lay down to sleep in the presence of another person and felt no fear. The air was not charged with threat or obligation. She was not property. She was not a prize to be won or a debt to be paid. Here in the vast, lonely darkness, beside this silent, broken man, she was simply safe, and for the first time in a very long time, she slept without dreaming. The confession hung in the air between them for days, a fragile new structure built in the ruins of their old silence. A change had occurred, subtle but seismic. They still moved in their separate orbits. He in the cabin, she on the porch. But the space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken knowledge of the ghosts they each carried. The quiet was no longer a wall, but a kind of respectful peace, an acknowledgement of wounds too deep for clumsy words. The sky began to turn on a Thursday. It started with the light. A strange, sickly yellow color bled into the afternoon, draining the vibrant blue from the sky and casting the world in a jaundiced glow. The air grew heavy, still, and thick, as if the desert were holding its breath. The usual high, thin breeze died completely, and a profound, unnatural silence fell over the land. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. Isla was mending a saddle blanket on the porch steps, her needle moving in a steady rhythm. But she found herself pausing, her senses on edge. She looked up at the sky, a feeling of deep unease prickling her skin. Tripp, who had been dozing in a patch of shade, got to his feet, whining low in his throat and pacing restlessly. From the corral, she heard Jed's voice, a low, urgent command to his horse. She looked over and saw him moving with a swift, economical purpose she hadn't seen before. He was checking the ropes on the corral gate, testing the hinges on the small, sturdy lean-to that served as a stable. He glanced once at the sky to the west, his face grim, the scar on his cheekbone a stark white line against his weathered skin. He knew what was coming. Then the wind began. It wasn't a breeze, it was a low, mournful moan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It carried with it the fine, gritty taste of the deep desert. Within minutes, the moan became a hiss, and the western horizon, which had been a clear, sharp line, began to blur and darken. It wasn't a cloud bank of rain. It was a wall of dust, a churning, roiling mass of brown and gray that was consuming the sky. Inside, Jed's voice cut through the rising wind. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. He was already striding toward her, his eyes narrowed against the grit that had begun to fill the air. "The horse!" Isla shouted back, her voice thin against the growing roar. The buckskin was still in the corral, stamping its feet and tossing its head, its eyes wide with animal panic. "I'll get him." "Get in the cabin," Jed yelled, pointing forcefully at the door. But a stubbornness, a feeling that she had to pull her own weight, that she could not be a helpless burden, took hold of Isla. She couldn't just hide while he did all the work. She ran from the porch, her skirts whipping around her legs, and headed for the corral, her eyes stinging from the dust. The world was dissolving into a brown chaos. The wind was a physical force now, pushing against her, trying to knock her off her feet. It screamed in her ears, a high, terrifying shriek. Sand and grit blasted against her exposed skin, stinging like 1,000 tiny needles. She reached the corral gate, her fingers fumbling with the rope latch. The buckskin was half mad with fear, rearing and plunging, its terrified whinnies torn away by the gale. "Easy, boy, easy," she murmured, though she knew the horse couldn't hear her over the storm's fury. She finally got the gate open and tried to herd the frantic animal toward the relative safety of the lean-to. He shied away from her, his eyes rolling, and bolted for the far side of the corral. Isla, her vision nearly obscured by the blinding dust, stumbled after him. It happened in a heartbeat. Her foot caught on an exposed tree root she didn't see. Her ankle twisted, and she went down hard. The air knocked from her lungs in a painful gasp. She landed on her side, her head striking the hard-packed earth. For a disoriented second, the world was a dizzying, roaring blur of brown. Then, through the swirling chaos, she saw the horse. It was rearing again, its powerful body a terrifying silhouette in the dust-choked air, its iron-shod hooves flashing just above her. A scream caught in her throat. This was it. This was how it ended. Not at the hands of Silas Croft, but here, under the panicked hooves of a horse in a blind storm. A shape hurtled through the maelstrom. It was Jed. He moved with a speed and ferocity that seemed to defy the wind itself. One powerful arm wrapped around her waist, hauling her from the ground as if she weighed nothing. He pulled her hard against his chest, turning his own body to shield her from the frantic horse. He was a wall of solid muscle and bone between her and death. She felt the shudder that ran through him as a hoof struck the ground inches from where her head had been. He didn't say a word. He just held her, his arm a band of steel around her, his other hand cupping the back of her head, pressing her face into the rough fabric of his shirt. She was enveloped in his scent leather, sweat, and the clean, primal smell of a man who lived with the earth. For a long, suspended moment, they stood locked together in the heart of the screaming chaos, two small figures against the rage of the elements. His body absorbed the wind's brutal force, his solid presence the only fixed point in a world that was coming apart. Then he was moving, half carrying, half dragging her toward the cabin. He kicked the door open and shoved her inside, stumbling in after her and slamming the heavy wooden door shut against the storm. The silence inside was deafening. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, reduced to a low, tormented howl. The world outside the single window was an opaque, churning brown. A fine layer of dust already coated every surface, and tiny drafts of sand hissed through invisible cracks in the log walls. A single lantern, which Jed must have lit before he came out, cast a weak, flickering circle of golden light in the center of the small room, leaving the corners in deep shadow. They stood just inside the door, breathing heavily, their chests rising and falling in unison. Isla's legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. Her ankle throbbed with a sharp, insistent pain. Jed's arm was still around her, his hand still tangled in her hair. They were closer than they had ever been, their bodies pressed together from shoulder to knee. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek. Slowly, he released her. His hands dropped to his sides, and he took a step back, breaking the contact. The sudden absence of his warmth was a shock, and a cold shiver ran through her, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He turned away from her and walked to the stone fireplace, where a few embers still glowed. He added a few small pieces of wood, his movements economical and precise. He was rebuilding the walls of their separate spaces, retreating back into his silence. Isla limped to the small table and sank onto a chair, her body trembling with the aftershock of her fear. The storm raged outside, a living thing trying to claw its way in. The cabin, which had once felt like a cage, now felt like the only sanctuary in the world. But it was a fragile sanctuary. The wind slammed against the walls, and the whole structure seemed to groan in protest. It felt like the end of the world. It felt like they were the last two people alive, marooned in a sea of violent, screaming dust. Death had felt so close just moments ago. It was still close, held at bay only by the thin log walls. Isla looked at Jed's back as he stared into the nascent flames. She thought of her journey, of the desperate dare that had driven her across the desert to his door. "I want one night. I want to choose it." The words seemed like they belonged to another person, a foolish, naive girl who hadn't understood the true nature of things. But the desire behind them was still there, sharper and more urgent than ever. If the storm took them, if the roof came down or they were buried in the shifting sands, she would die with nothing. No memories but those of fear and flight. The world had chosen for her, again and again. It had chosen for her in her father's saloon, and it had nearly chosen for her under the hooves of a panicked horse. She would not let the storm be the last choice. She spoke his name, and it was barely a whisper, almost swallowed by the howl of the wind. "Jed." He turned, his face half in shadow, half in the flickering firelight. His stormy eyes were fixed on her, waiting. The words came from a place deeper than thought, a place of pure, honest instinct, born of the roaring darkness outside and the fragile, flickering light within. "If this is the last night," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "will you let me feel something true?" It was not the demand she had first imagined making. It was a plea, a question asked between two broken souls on what could be the edge of oblivion. He looked at her for a long time, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. The firelight danced in his eyes, revealing depths of sorrow and something else, something she had never seen there before. He crossed the small room in two long, silent strides. He did not stop until he was standing before her. He knelt, so their eyes were on the same level. He didn't speak. He had never been a man for words. He answered her with his hands, reaching out and gently, so gently, cupping her face. His thumb stroked over her cheekbones, wiping away the mixture of dust and tears that stained her skin. His touch was rough, the calluses on his palms a testament to his hard life, but it was the most tender gesture she had ever known. Then he leaned in and kissed her. It was nothing like she had ever imagined a kiss could be. There was no hurry in it, no sudden claiming. It was not the taking of a thing that had been offered. It was a gift. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, a question asked in a language older than words. Then, as she leaned into the kiss, it deepened. It was a kiss of profound and aching tenderness. It was a kiss that acknowledged her fear, her pain, her desperate bravery. It held all the sorrow of his past and all the fragile hope of her future. It was not a kiss that took anything from her. It was a kiss that gave. It felt like he was gently, carefully, putting back a piece of her soul that had been stolen long ago. It was, in the heart of the storm, the truest thing she had ever felt. The storm scoured the world clean. It passed in the deep of the night, its final howls fading to a weary sigh, and the morning that followed was born into a world of pristine, unnatural stillness. A fine, pale dust covered everything, softening the harsh lines of the rocks and blanketing the ground in a smooth, unblemished sheet. The air was cool and tasted of rain that had fallen somewhere far away. Inside the cabin, a new world had been born as well. The kiss had not been an end, but a beginning. It had dismantled the invisible fence between them, board by silent board. When Isla awoke on her bedroll on the porch, it was to find a cup of coffee and a tin plate with 2 Johnny cakes waiting on the step, just as always. But when Jed emerged from the cabin, he didn't just nod and turn to his chores. He met her eyes, and his gaze held hers for a long moment. No words were spoken, but everything was different, acknowledged. They spent the morning in a silent dance of shared purpose. They swept the thick dust from the porch, cleared the sand that had drifted against the cabin walls, and repaired a section of the corral fence that had been weakened by the wind. They moved around each other with an unspoken awareness, a new gravity that pulled them into a shared orbit. When his hand brushed hers as they both reached for the same tool, a jolt, warm and electric, passed between them. Neither of them pulled away. The fear Isla had lived with for so long had been replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. She felt seen, not as a commodity, not as a problem, but as a person. His kiss had not been a claim of ownership, but an act of restoration. It had affirmed the part of her that Silas Croft and her father had tried to erase her will, her choice. They were watering the horse in the late afternoon when the new dust appeared on the horizon. This time it was not a single plume, it was 3. They were thicker, darker, and they moved with an unhurried confidence that the lone rider, Finn, had lacked. There was a grim, methodical purpose to their approach. Jed saw it at the same time she did. He set his bucket down with a soft, final thud. Every ounce of the newfound softness in his posture vanished. The quiet man who had shared his coffee and his fire was gone. And in his place was the man who had faced down Finn, the man whose eyes could become as empty and final as a grave. He wiped his hands on his trousers, a slow, deliberate motion, and his gaze became flat and hard. Isla felt a familiar ice seep into her veins. The fragile peace of the morning shattered like a pane of glass. The world had found her again. The hounds were back on the scent. She instinctively took a half-step back, her body wanting to retreat, to hide, to become small. But then she felt the ghost of his kiss on her lips, the memory of his hands holding her face as if she were something precious. He had not seen her as a creature to be owned. He had seen her as a person to be shielded, and that knowledge was an anchor in the sudden, violent storm of her fear. She had something to lose now, not just her life, but this fragile, silent thing they were building together in the middle of nowhere. She would not hide. Not this time. She planted her feet and stood her ground, her gaze fixed on the approaching riders. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, forming a loose, menacing semicircle. 2 of them were the kind of men who haunted the saloons and back alleys of every dusty town hard-faced, their eyes cold and watchful. One was lanky and wolfish, a perpetual, cruel smirk playing on his lips. The other was thick-necked and bovine, his expression dull, his hands resting on his saddle horn, as big as slabs of bacon. But it was the third man who made the air leave Isla's lungs. He sat on a fine black mare, a stark contrast to the dusty workhorses of his companions. He was dressed not in a cowboy's denim and leather, but in a dark town coat and a bowler hat, both now powdered with a fine layer of dust. He was soft and fleshy where the other men were hard and lean, his face clean-shaven, his hands, holding the reins, plump and pale. It was a face that had haunted her nightmares. Silas Croft. He looked around the small, poor homestead with an expression of profound distaste, as if he had just stepped in something foul. Then his eyes settled on Isla, and a slow, oily smile of satisfaction spread across his lips. It was the smile of a merchant who had finally located a misplaced, valuable piece of merchandise. "Isla, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and condescending, entirely out of place in the raw, open landscape. "It appears your little adventure has come to an end. Did you really think you could run from me?" He ignored Jed completely, as if he were nothing more than a fence post or a rock. "I'll admit, you led us on quite a chase," Croft continued, his tone one of amused paternalism. "But all things must end. I have a contract, a legal, binding document, signed by your father. A promise is a promise. My dear girl." He produced a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, holding it up as if it were a holy relic. "A bounty warrant. For the return of my runaway bride. It seems you've caused quite a lot of trouble." Jed took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Isla. It was the same protective stance he had taken with Finn. His hand did not go to his gun. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable object. Croft finally deigned to acknowledge him. He looked Jed up and down, his gaze lingering on the worn clothes and the scarred face. His smile tightened with contempt. "And who is this?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your new keeper, I must say. Isla, your tastes have declined. I am a man of property, of standing, and you run away to a squatter in a mud hut." The two hired guns chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Isla felt a tremor run through her. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to let Jed handle it, to hide behind the wall of his silent strength. The old Isla, the girl who had fled Silver Creek in the dead of night, would have done just that. But she was not that girl anymore. She took a breath, the clean, dry air filling her lungs. She looked at Silas Croft, at his soft, possessive face, at the smug certainty in his eyes, and she saw him for what he was: not a powerful man, but a weak one. A man whose only strength came from paper contracts and hired guns. A man who needed to own things, to own people, to feel like he mattered. Jed had shown her what true strength was. It was quiet. It was steadfast. And it was a choice. She made her choice. She took a step, and then another. A deliberate, measured movement that brought her out from behind Jed's shoulder. She walked until she stood beside him, facing her tormentor directly. She was trembling. A fine, high-frequency shudder that shook her from the inside out. But she held her chin high. She met Silas Croft's surprised gaze without flinching. He had always spoken about her as if she were not there. He had bargained for her, contracted her, hunted her. Now, she would force him to hear her. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It was not a shout of defiance. It was quiet, steady, and it cut through the air like a shard of glass. "I'm not yours anymore." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Croft's smug expression wavered, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. Then anger. The idea that she, his property, would speak to him with such finality was an insult he could not comprehend. Then he laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound, full of genuine, derisive amusement. The wolfish man and the thick-necked man joined in, their laughter harsh and mocking. To them, her declaration was a joke, the squeak of a mouse defying the cat. It was the most profound and complete dismissal of her entire existence. "Not mine," Croft said, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. "Oh, my dear, foolish girl, you have always been mine. From the moment your father put his name on that paper, you just didn't know it yet." His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard finality. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the two men beside him. "It's time to come home." The laughter stopped, and in a single, fluid motion, the two hired guns drew their pistols. The click of the hammers being pulled back was a deafening punctuation mark. The sun glinted off the long, blue steel barrels of their revolvers. The moment froze. Suspended in the hot, still air, a smiling man in a town coat, two ready guns, a silent cowboy, and a girl who had finally found her voice. Just as the world prepared to silence her for good. Time did not slow down. It shattered. The instant before the world broke apart, Ela saw everything with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. She saw the cruel, triumphant smirk on the wolfish man's face as his finger tightened on the trigger. She saw the dull, bovine disinterest in the other man's eyes, the look of a butcher about to perform a routine, messy task. She saw the smug, possessive satisfaction on Silas Croft's face, the look of a man who had finally cornered a stray animal and was about to put a leash on it for good. And she saw Jed. He didn't move, not in any way she could perceive, but the stillness that had defined him coalesced into something else entirely, a point of absolute, lethal focus. Then the world exploded in a deafening clap of thunder that was not thunder. Jed's hand was a blur. It was not the movement of a man drawing a gun. It was as if the Colt revolver simply appeared in his fist, an extension of his will. Before the wolfish man's smirk had a chance to fade, Jed's pistol bucked once, a single, sharp, definitive crack. A neat, dark hole appeared in the center of the wolfish man's chest. His eyes went wide with a comical surprise, the smirk dissolving into a confused grimace. He toppled sideways from his horse, hitting the ground with a loose, boneless thud. The air was instantly thick with the acrid, sulphurous smell of gunpowder, a smell that burned Isla's nostrils and made her eyes water. The second man, the thick-necked one, was slower, but his gun was already out. He fired, a cannon blast that seemed to shake the very ground. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of dirt a foot to Jed's left. Before the man could correct his aim, Jed's gun spoke again. Another single, economical report. The thick-necked man grunted, a sound like an animal in pain, and dropped his pistol. He clutched at his shoulder, his dull face contorted in a mask of shock and agony, and wheeled his horse around, kicking it into a frantic, clumsy retreat. It had taken less than 2 seconds. 2 shots, 2 men dealt with. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and brutal piece of economy. Silas Croft, who had been sitting on his fine horse with the smug confidence of a king, was now staring at the scene with a slack-jawed disbelief. His hired strength, his wall of violence, had crumbled into dust in the blink of an eye. For the first time, raw, undiluted fear appeared on his soft face. He was alone. Isla felt a surge of something wild and triumphant. He was afraid. She had made him afraid. No, Jed had, but she had stood beside him. Jed took a half-step forward, his pistol still held level, his attention now fully on Croft. The world narrowed to the 2 of them, the hunter and the prey. And that was when the third shot came. It came from the ground. The wolfish man, not as dead as he had seemed, had managed to lift his pistol one last time. It was a dying man's spasm, a final, reflexive act of violence. The shot was wild, unaimed, a piece of lead sent into the world by a collapsing body. But the world is made of luck, good and bad. Jed grunted, a low, sharp sound of pain that cut through the ringing in Isla's ears. He staggered, his left hand flying to his side, just below his ribs. His steady, focused posture broke. He took a faltering step, then another, his gun wavering in his hand. The absolute certainty, the lethal grace, was gone. He was hurt. The sight of him stumbling, of the dark stain that was already beginning to spread across the side of his shirt, was like a physical blow to Isla's chest. The triumphant surge she had felt moments before curdled into a new and more terrible kind of fear. The protector was down. The shield was broken. Croft saw it, too. His fear, which had been stark and absolute, was instantly replaced by a renewed, predatory arrogance. The balance of power had shifted again. "It seems your champion has stumbled, my dear," Croft sneered, his voice shaking but laced with a new, ugly confidence. He began to reach inside his own town coat. He had a gun of his own, a small, concealable pistol for a man who paid others to do his fighting. Jed tried to raise his pistol, but his arm was weak. He was struggling to stay on his feet, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He was vulnerable. Time shattered again for Isla. Her world, which had just been a cacophony of noise and violence, went utterly silent and still. All she could hear was the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart. All she could see was Jed, bleeding in the dust, and Silas Croft, reaching for the gun that would finish him. The old Isla would have screamed. She would have frozen. She would have crumpled to the ground in terror. But the old Isla was dead. She had died in the dust storm, and she had been reborn in a kiss that tasted of truth. Her hand, of its own volition, went to the rusty pistol tucked in her waistband, her mother's gun. The cold, heavy weight of it was a shock, a solid reality in a world that was spinning out of control. She pulled it free. It felt heavy as a gravestone, clumsy and foreign in her grip. She lifted it, her arm shaking so violently she could barely aim. The barrel wavered, dancing between the sky and the ground. She gripped it with both hands, trying to still the tremor, her knuckles white. She could feel Jed's blood on the ground, could see the finality in Croft's eyes. She had run from this man. She had crossed a desert to escape him. She had stood up to him with words. Now, words were not enough. She looked down the rusty barrel of the pistol. Through the trembling of her hands, she saw Silas Croft's face. She saw his smug smile, the smile that had sealed her fate over a bottle of cheap whiskey. She saw his possessive eyes, the eyes that had stripped her of her name and called her property. He was raising his own small pistol now, a little silver derringer, aiming it at Jed's slumped form. Isla pulled the trigger. The gun kicked with a force that seemed to travel all the way up her arm and into her shoulder. The explosion was a dull, heavy boom, nothing like the sharp crack of Jed's Colt. For a horrifying second, she thought the old gun had misfired, or that she had missed entirely. But then, a dark flower bloomed on the pristine white of Silas Croft's shirt, just over his heart. His eyes went wide, not with pain, but with a look of profound, indignant surprise, as if he could not believe that a piece of his property had dared to strike back. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The silver derringer slipped from his plump fingers and fell silently into the dust. He swayed in the saddle for a moment, and then he fell. He fell not like a man, but like a sack of grain, collapsing sideways and hitting the ground with a soft, final thud. Silence. A profound, ringing silence descended. The thick-necked man was a memory of dust on the horizon. The wolfish man lay still, and Silas Croft, the man who had called her his wife, was a heap of dark cloth in the red dirt. Isla stood there, the heavy pistol still held out in her trembling hands. The smell of gunpowder was thick in her throat. She was breathing harsh, ragged gasps of air that did nothing to fill her lungs. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not feel triumph. She felt nothing. A vast, hollow emptiness where the fear had been. She had looked into the abyss, and she had pulled the trigger. Then, a low groan from her right. Jed! The emptiness was instantly filled with a new, sharper terror. She dropped the pistol as if it had burned her and scrambled to his side. He was on his knees now, hunched over, his face ashen. The dark stain on his shirt was bigger, a wet, crimson patch that was spreading with alarming speed. "Jed," she breathed, her voice a raw whisper. She knelt in front of him, her hands hovering uselessly over the wound. She didn't know what to do. She had taken a life to save his, but she had no idea how to keep him from leaving her. He slumped forward, and she caught him, his dead weight almost too much for her. She eased him onto his back. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He was motionless. "No," she whispered, the word a prayer. "No, no, no." Her hands, slick with his blood, fumbled at her own dress. She tore a long strip from her petticoat, her fingers clumsy and thick. She balled it up and pressed it hard against the wound in his side. The fabric turned dark and sodden almost instantly. It wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough. She looked at his still face, at the scar that seemed so pale against his bloodless skin. She had come to him with a selfish, desperate request. She had asked him for a memory, and he had given her something infinitely more precious. He had given her a reason to stand and fight. He had shown her that her life was her own. He had given her back to herself. And now, he was leaving. A terrible, tearing sob rose in her throat, raw and desperate. She leaned close to his ear, her lips brushing against his skin, her tears finally falling, hot and fast, onto his cheek. She whispered, her voice broken, fierce, and full of a love she hadn't even had a name for until this very moment. "Don't you dare leave me after giving me back myself." He did not die. The hours that followed the gunfight were a desperate, bloody blur. Isla, fueled by a terror that was colder and sharper than any she had ever known, managed to drag him inside the cabin. He was a dead weight, his body limp, leaving a dark, wet trail across the dusty floorboards. She laid him on his own narrow cot, the one she had only ever glimpsed from the doorway. It became his sickbed, and the cabin. Once his impenetrable fortress became her world. The bullet had gone clean through, a small mercy in a brutal situation. She saw the exit wound, ragged and angry on his back, when she rolled him over to get his bloody shirt off, working by the unsteady light of the lantern, her hands still shaking. She boiled water and tore strips from her last clean petticoat. She washed the wounds as best she could, her touch clumsy but gentle. She had no whiskey to pour on it, no doctor's knowledge, only a desperate will to keep him tethered to the world. She packed the wounds with the cleanest cloth she had and bound his torso tightly, her own tears sometimes falling onto his pale, still face. For 2 days, he was lost to a fever. He tossed and turned, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He muttered names she didn't know Clara. Ma, his voice thick with delirium. Isla did not sleep. She sat by his side on a low stool, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips, and changing the bloody bandages until her own fingers were raw. The 3 bodies lay outside in the sun, a grim testament to the violence that had brought them to this point. She did not look at them. She could not. Her entire universe had shrunk to the size of this small, dark room and the shallow breathing of the man on the cot. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. She awoke from a slumped, fitful doze in her chair to find him looking at her. His eyes were clear, the fever haze gone. They were still stormy and full of pain, but they were his. He was back. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her, and she had to press her fist to her mouth to stifle it. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, rasping whisper. "Water." She practically ran to the bucket, her hands trembling as she filled a dipper. She held it to his lips, supporting his head with her other hand, and let him drink. He managed a few sips before slumping back against the thin pillow, his eyes closing with exhaustion. But he was alive. He had stayed. And so began the waiting season. Jed lived, but the wound had stolen his formidable strength. He was weak as a newborn, unable to do more than shift his weight on the cot. The silent, capable man who moved with such economy and grace was gone, replaced by a dependent invalid who needed her for everything. The roles were reversed. She, who had come seeking his protection, was now his sole protector. Her life, which had found a quiet rhythm on the porch, was now a constant cycle of labor inside the cabin. She learned because she had to. The water barrel wouldn't fill itself. The fire wouldn't stay lit. There was no one else to do the work. Her hands, once soft from mending clothes, became hard and calloused. She learned the heft and balance of Jed's axe, the satisfying thud it made when she finally managed to split a log cleanly. Her shoulders ached, and her back screamed in protest. But with each swing, she felt a new kind of strength taking root in her. She learned to use his rifle, the one he kept mounted over the fireplace. The first time she fired it at a jackrabbit, the recoil knocked her backward into the dirt, and the noise left her ears ringing. But she hit her target. She cleaned the animal with a grim determination, her stomach turning, and cooked it into a thin, nourishing broth for Jed. It was the first real meat he had eaten since the shooting, and as she spoon-fed it to him, she felt a fierce, primal pride. She became the keeper of his life. She changed his bandages, her initial revulsion giving way to a clinical focus. She saw the wound slowly begin to close, the angry red fading to a healthy pink around the edges. She applied a poultice of chewed yarrow leaves, A remedy an old woman in Silver Creek had once told her was good for stopping bleeding and warding off infection. She didn't know if it worked, but she had to do something. Every small sign of healing was a victory. Jed accepted her care with a profound, weary silence. There was no room for pride. He was too weak to fight her ministrations. But she could see the frustration in his eyes, the deep humiliation of a man so self-reliant being reduced to such helplessness. Sometimes, when she was helping him sit up to drink, their eyes would meet, and she would see a storm of emotions there, gratitude, pain, and a deep, aching vulnerability that he had never shown before. In those moments, the last of the invisible walls between them crumbled to dust. They were no longer a man and a woman with a strange bargain. They were just two people, bound together by blood and necessity, holding on in the vast emptiness of the desert. About a week into his recovery, a new visitor arrived. Isla was outside, struggling to hoist a bucket of water from the well, when she saw a small figure approaching. It was a boy, no more than 10 years old, with a shock of bright red hair and a face full of freckles. He was leading a stubborn-looking goat on a rope. Isla's first instinct was fear. Her hand went to the rusty pistol she now kept tucked in her waistband at all times. But the boy showed no alarm. He waved at her with a wide, friendly grin. "Howdy, ma'am," he called out. "Is Mr. Callan about? I brought him some milk. Ma says it's good for what ails you." Isla stared at him, bewildered. "How do you know him?" "He's my friend," the boy said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Name's Tom, Mr. Callan. He helped my PA out once, with some claim jumpers." The boy's face darkened for a moment, a shadow of an old fear passing over it. "Saved us," is what he did. So this was the child from the story. The reason Jed's name was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. "He's unwell," Isla said carefully. "He was hurt." Tom's freckled face fell. "Is he bad off?" "He's resting," Isla said. "But he'll be all right." She said it with a conviction she didn't entirely feel. The boy tied his goat to the fence post and held out the small pail of milk. "Well, you give this to him, and you tell him Tom said to get better soon." From that day on, Tom became a fixture. He would arrive every afternoon, sometimes with milk, sometimes with a few eggs from his family's chickens, once with a handful of misshapen carrots pulled from their garden. He was a small, bright spark of life in the quiet, tense world of the cabin. He would sit on the porch steps and talk, a cheerful, unending stream of chatter about his goat, his pa's bad back, and the coyote he'd seen the night before. He didn't seem to notice the 3 grave markers Isla had finally forced herself to make out of rough crosses of juniper wood, placed on a low rise 100 yards from the cabin. Or if he did, he didn't ask. He just accepted this strange new reality that Mr. Callan was inside, hurt, and this quiet, serious woman was taking care of him. At first, Isla was wary of him, but his simple, uncomplicated presence was a balm. He brought the outside world in, a world where people got better, where gardens grew, and where a boy could love his goat. He brought laughter. One afternoon, he told a long, rambling story about his goat eating his mother's laundry, and Isla found herself laughing, a real, genuine laugh that felt rusty from disuse. From inside, Jed heard it. When she went back into the cabin, he was watching her, a faint, curious expression on his face. "The boy," he rasped, his voice getting a little stronger each day. "He's a good kid." "He is," Isla agreed. "He worries about you." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Jed's lips. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. It transformed his harsh, scarred face, softening the lines of pain and sorrow. The sight of it made her heart ache with a feeling she was too afraid to name. As the weeks passed, Jed began to heal. He could sit up on his own, then stand for a few moments, leaning heavily on the wall. Isla would watch him, her heart in her throat, as he took his first few faltering steps across the small cabin. Each step was a monumental victory. One afternoon, she was sitting on the porch with Tom, helping him whittle a piece of wood into a crude-looking bird. Jed was asleep inside. "You're good at that," Tom said, watching her careful, precise movements with the knife. "You're good at a lot of things, chopping wood and all. My ma says you must be a strong woman." Isla looked down at her hands. They were stained, calloused, and marked with small nicks and scars. They didn't look like her hands anymore. She thought of the girl who had arrived here weeks ago, a girl whose only skill was mending clothes, whose only plan was a desperate, foolish dare. That girl seemed like a stranger from a different lifetime. She hadn't just been keeping Jed alive. She had been building a life, a hard, demanding life, but one that was hers. Every split log, every bucket of water, every meal she cooked was a testament to her own survival, her own strength. She hadn't just learned how to shoot a gun, she had learned how to feed herself, how to keep a home, how to care for another human being. The realization settled over her, quiet and profound as the desert sun set. She had come here with one specific, narrow goal in mind. I don't want to die untouched. It had been a girl's desperate cry against being erased. She had been so focused on the idea of a single, chosen memory to take with her into death. But she hadn't died. And Jed, in his quiet, broken way, had given her something far more valuable than one night. He had given her a reason to live. His vulnerability had forced her to find her own strength. His need had taught her what it meant to be needed. His silent cabin had become her home. Tom's laughter was the sound of a future she had never thought she would have. She had come here seeking not to die a virgin. She understood now that what she had really been seeking was not to die at all. She had come here to live, for the very first time. The waiting season bled into a season of growth. Summer arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering force, claiming the land with a fierce, brilliant heat. The pale, dusty canvas of the desert floor, scoured clean by the storm, erupted in a riot of improbable color. Carpets of yellow poppies and purple lupine spread across the basins, a defiant tide of life in a land that had always seemed dedicated to death. The air, once sharp and thin, grew thick and sweet with the scent of sage and sun-baked blossoms. With the return of life to the land, life returned more fully to Jed. The deep, painful wound in his side closed, leaving a puckered, angry scar that was a stark new chapter in the story his body told. His strength came back slowly, a trickle at first, then a steady stream. One day, Isla awoke to the familiar, rhythmic thud of the axe splitting wood. She rushed to the door and saw him there, his back to her, his movement still stiff but full of a reclaimed purpose. He had taken the axe from her. Her role as his keeper was ending. A strange pang of both relief and loss went through her. She had found a fierce pride in her ability to care for him, to keep their small world turning. Now, the balance shifted again, settling into a new and unknown equilibrium. He was still quiet, but his silence had changed. It was no longer the haunted, empty silence of a man barricaded against the world. It was a comfortable, lived-in silence, the kind shared by two people who have no need for words to understand one another. He started to teach her things, not with lessons, but with gestures, a pointed finger at a set of tracks in the dust, a slight nod toward a hawk circling on a thermal. He taught her the language of the land, his native tongue. In turn, she brought a different language to the cabin. She filled it with the scent of baking bread, using the small supply of flour she'd found. She mended his clothes with stitches that were fine and even. She even convinced Tom to help her plant a small, struggling garden of beans and squash near the well, a hopeful patch of green against the overwhelming red and brown. The cabin, once a stark bachelor's shelter, began to feel like a home. It was a place where two solitary people were slowly, carefully, learning how to be a we. The kiss in the storm was never mentioned. It existed between them as a single, perfect moment, a foundation so profound and certain that to speak of it would be to diminish it. But its presence was in every glance they shared, in every time their hands brushed as they worked, in the way they now moved around each other not as strangers, but as partners in a silent, intricate dance. The days settled into a peaceful, sun-drenched rhythm. Tom's daily visits were a bright thread in the fabric of their lives. He would bring news from his family's small farm and sit with Jed on the porch, chattering away while Jed listened. His expression softened by an emotion Isla was beginning to recognize as a kind of weary affection. He was the child Jed had saved, and he was a living reminder that not all battles were lost, that sometimes you could be there in time. One evening, as the summer sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of crimson and gold, Isla sat on the porch steps, watching Jed repair a bridle. His hands, which she now knew so well, moved with their old, sure strength, the leather and steel pliant under his touch. He was whole again. He was the man she had come seeking. And yet he was not. He was someone deeper, more complex, someone whose wounds she now knew as intimately as her own. She looked out at the rolling hills, now softened by the evening light and dotted with the last of the season's wildflowers. The world was quiet, peaceful. The ghosts of Silas Croft and his men were just that, ghosts. Their crude graves on the nearby rise a stark reminder of the violence that had forged this new peace. She thought of the girl who had stumbled out of the desert and arrived at this very spot. A girl driven by a desperate, half-formed idea of claiming a single moment for herself before she died. What a small, frightened dream that had been. She had come here wanting a memory to die with. Instead, she had been given a life to live, a hard, beautiful, real life. She had learned the strength in her own hands, the sound of her own voice, the weight of her own choices. She had faced down the monster from her past and had not flinched. And she had fallen in love with a silent, broken man who had, by saving her, somehow begun to save himself. Her old request felt like a child's wish whispered into a well. Now, she had a woman's desire, clear and steady as the northern star. It was a desire not for a single night, but for all the nights to come. It was a risk. She knew. He was a man who had walled off his heart to protect it from the pain of ever losing someone again. He had given her sanctuary. He had given her protection. He had given her a single, soul-altering kiss. But he had never given her a promise. She had to ask. She had to know if this quiet, fragile home they had built was a temporary shelter, or if it was a place where they could both lay down their arms for good. She rose from the step and went to sit on the worn wooden bench beside him. He looked up from his work, his stormy eyes questioning. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers stilled, the piece of leather he was working falling forgotten into his lap. His hand was rough and calloused, a map of his hard life. She traced the lines on his palm with her thumb, the simple touch a universe of unspoken things. His hand, which had been so still, turned and curled around hers, his grip warm and firm. She finally met his gaze. The setting sun was reflected in his eyes, two small embers in the stormy gray. "I once asked you for one night," she said, her voice soft but steady, with no trace of the trembling girl who had stood here months ago. "Now, I want all the rest. If you'll have me." There it was, the truth of her heart, laid bare in the golden evening light. It was a bigger, more terrifying request than her first one, because this time, she had so much more to lose. He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her, his gaze searching her face, her eyes, her very soul. She saw the ghost flicker in his eyes, the memory of Clara, the weight of his failure, the fear of a future that held the possibility of new pain. She held her breath, her heart a painful, hopeful knot in her chest. She braced herself for a shake of the head, a gentle refusal, a retreat back into the safety of his solitude. But then the ghosts receded, and for the second time in her life, she saw him smile. It was not the faint ghost of a smile he gave Tom. It was a real, slow-spreading smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and erasing the years of sorrow from his face. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He did not just nod. He lifted her hand, the one he was holding, to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to her knuckles. "Isla," he said, and the sound of her name in his rough, quiet voice was a song she had waited her whole life to hear. "As long as the land is dry and the sun rises, you'll be mine." It was not a claim of ownership. It was a promise, a vow, as enduring and absolute as the desert itself. It was everything. The tension, the fear, the last lingering shreds of the frightened girl she had once been, all dissolved in that moment, washed away by a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of arrival. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He still held her hand, his fingers laced through hers. He didn't look at the cabin. He looked out, past the corral, to the fields awash in the deep, warm colors of the sunset. Together, they stepped off the porch, and they walked down into the field of wildflowers, their steps in sync, their hands clasped tight, leaving the ghosts and the violence behind them. They walked into the beginning of all their days to come. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help share it with more listeners.